Hi there, and welcome to this in-depth walkthrough for Space Age Rhythm, our new Kontakt library that gives you the authentic sound of a mid-century rhythm section in your DAW. In the previous video, I gave an overview of the library, what's included, how it sounds. In this video, I'm going to go in-depth, and I'm going to be playing the instruments as I go, but the focus of this video will be on showing how to use the instruments rather than demonstrate how they sound. So let's get started. To get started, open an instance of Kontakt in your DAW or in standalone mode, and make sure the Browser tab is visible. This library won't appear in the Libraries tab, so we need to switch to the Files tab. From the Files tab, navigate to the folder you selected when you downloaded the library. Inside, you should find a file structure similar to this. All the core instruments are at the top level of the Instruments folder, and there's a subfolder called Percussion Singles that contains separate NKI files for each individual percussion instrument. In the Multis folder, there are two NKM patches with pre-configured ensembles. To load an instrument, simply double-click on the file name or drag it directly into the Kontakt rack. I'm going to go ahead and load the hollow body guitar. Let's take a look at the elements that are consistent or similar across all the instruments. At the top of the interface, from left to right, you'll find the echo return knob, the velocity meter, and the limiter threshold control knob. You turn the echo knob clockwise to increase the return signal from the reverb effect. Each instrument has a reverb setting chosen specifically to complement that instrument. However, to save CPU resources, you might want to instead just route all the instruments in your project to a common reverb on an aux return in your DAW. The limit knob controls a transparent limiter at the final output of the instrument. You turn it counterclockwise to lower the threshold and engage more limiting and increase your output level. The samples have had no dynamics processing applied to give you full control over the tone and the dynamic range of all the instruments. For all the effects in the library, turning the corresponding control all the way to the off position, which is usually fully counterclockwise, sets the effect into bypass mode. In Kontakt, this reduces your CPU load, so it's a good practice to turn them all the way off if you're not using them. The velocity meter gives you some visual feedback as to how hard you're striking the keyboard, but it shouldn't be confused for a volume meter, which is found in the top right corner of the instrument. For instruments such as this guitar that have an option to choose between a DI path and an amp modeler path, choosing the DI option bypasses the drive and air controls in addition to the amp modeler, on the assumption that you're likely opting to use a dedicated amp modeler and will just want a clean signal, or perhaps just use the DI as is. The guitar and the lap steel offer a delay effect with controls on the right-hand side here. This is NI's replica delay, which is a fantastic sounding delay, but it is a bit CPU hungry. So if you're not really using it, turn the delay amount knob fully counterclockwise to bypass the effect, and it defaults to that position. Okay, for instruments that have key switchable articulations, such as the guitar we're looking at now, the center section of the interface generally shows the current selected articulation. There are icons to give you a visual representation of what that articulation is. You can click on the name of the articulations to select one, or play a corresponding key on your MIDI keyboard to select an articulation. The key switches generally begin on C0. The guitar and the lap steel also have momentary trigger keys that I'll discuss a bit later. At the bottom of the interface, you'll see this group of Pitchbend range buttons. For the guitar and lap steel, you can use these buttons to set the exact pitch bend range, up or down. There are also corresponding purple keys towards the top of the keyboard that allow you to record changes to the pitch bend range into your sequencer in the same way you would use a key switch to change articulations. This can be really handy and gives you easy control over pitch bend gestures you may want to make that require more or less fine control. Lastly, just a note about the help text. We've included help text for virtually every control and note in the library. So if you're ever stuck, just try hovering your mouse over the control or note on the keyboard in question, and you should see some help text in this area here that could help answer your question. Okay, so that's it for the common controls. Let's dive into some of the individual instruments. Since I already have it up, let's talk about this guitar first. This hollow body guitar was fitted with a Bigsby vibrato tailpiece and has lots of fun wiggles and wobbles and has a really fantastic warm tone. It has 12 articulations, as you can see, including 2 legato modes. The instrument was recorded direct with the option to engage a Kontakt amp modeler with these controls on the left-hand side, although you may ultimately want to use one of the many great sounding amp modeling plugins out there to give you more control over the tone. In that case, you'd leave this selected to DI. Selecting the amp button also engages these drive and air controls to give you some additional tonal options. On the right hand side, we have the delay controls. There's knobs for the delay time, delay feedback, and delay amount. Okay, so now I'm just going to play a few notes of each articulation. Sustain, staccato, slide down, slide up, long bend, our long wobble, the palm mute long, which is not that long, depending on the register you're playing in. Palm mute short. I'm going to skip the legato modes for now. I'll come back to that later. So let's go to the chords long. And the chord falls in major and minor. You'll also notice a couple yellow colored keys below the main key switch keys. These keys will trigger a special release for any of the sustain related articulations. A-1 triggers a slide down and the B triggers a slide up. The velocity with which you play the trigger key determines how loud the release sample will be. So for realism, you'll probably want to play the trigger key at least a bit softer than the note or notes that are ringing out. For the polyphonic articulations, these triggers are polyphonic as well. For the legato articulations, they're monophonic. Okay, now let me talk about the legato modes. When you select a legato articulation, playing connected notes that are within the range of a major third, so that's 4 semitones, will play a true legato transition. If you play an interval larger than that range or don't overlap the notes, it just plays a standard sustain attack. So these articulations are always going to be monophonic, but the way you play and the interval between subsequent notes determines whether a legato transition sample is played between the notes or not. The legato samples were recorded in the manner where the player played the transition and left the connected note ring out for its full value in one performance, so it's not like crossfading back and forth between the transition samples 2 times. Legato mode 1 gives you hammer-on and pull-off transitions that sound like this. Legato mode 2 is kind of special and can take a little getting used to. So in this mode, the player slides their finger along the string to the next note and then reattacks the note. So the duration of the transition is different depending on how wide the interval is. It can be really fun to play and adds a great sense of realism, but you may just have to adjust the timing of your notes a bit. For legato mode 2, there's also this supplementary control that uses Kontakt's Time Machine Pro algorithm to adjust the timing of the transition portion of the sample. So turning the knob clockwise makes the transitions faster, and counterclockwise makes them slower. This can help you adjust the transitions to work with the tempo you're playing. And lastly, let me just show you how to use these pitch bend buttons. Playing one of these purple keys at the top of the keyboard or pushing one of the buttons will set the range, and then you can do a bend of the exact interval you want. And you can record this into your sequencer just like you would with a key switch so that you can change it on the fly. So that wraps up the guitar. Let's move on to the lap steel next because it shares a lot in common with this guitar. The lap steel is a vintage Gibson guitar, and we focused almost entirely on kitschy chord glides and slides and gestures in the true space-age pop style. So it's not really intended to be a country western style melodic lap steel instrument. This one shares a lot in common with the guitar we just talked about. It has the same amp modular controls, the delay, and the pitch bend range controls. It has what may look like 10 articulations, but there are actually nested alternates for some of them, which are accessed by moving the mod wheel up or down. When the mod wheel is down, the articulations that have a sliding character to them slide from down to up. When the mod wheel is up, it's the opposite. They go from up to down. The UI updates to show you the current state. So by combining the key switch with the mod wheel position, you can choose the exact sound you want. Let me just show that to you right now. The articulations marked basic have little or no vibrato baked in, but the other ones do. So to add some vibrato to the basic articulations, you can use the vibrato knob in the lower right-hand corner down here. It comes pre-mapped to CC2, but you can assign it to any CC you want by right-clicking on the control and using Kontakt's MIDI learn function. I'll just play a couple notes demonstrating that now. The lap steel also has release trigger keys down here. And pitch bend range controls that work the same way as the hollow body guitar. Let's listen to that. Okay, so that's it for the lap steel. Okay, now let's talk about our fantastic percussion. We recorded this percussion at the Relic Room here in New York City, which is one of my favorite studios. And this percussionist lived and studied music in Havana, Cuba, and is really steeped in this style. There's a convenient ensemble patch, which is what you're seeing right now, that has all the instruments loaded up in one patch. Then for even more control over your mix, we also included individual patches of each instrument. Just one quick note, there are two single instrument patches that don't appear in the ensemble patch, which are the tempo synced maraca and tambourine loops. Those have to be loaded as individual patches. The ensemble patch also has a slightly limited set of samples just because of available space to lay it all out across the keyboard. On this ensemble patch, each instrument has its own volume and pan control here, although the maracas and tambourine are grouped together under shakers, and the güiro and triangle are grouped together on the channel labeled aux. You can hover over each active note on the keyboard to see what kind of sample is mapped to that key. I'm just quickly going to play each note once or twice just to give you a taste here. The Percussion has 3 different microphone positions available. Mic 1 is a vintage close position captured with a mono RCA 44BX overhead mic and a Telefunken U47. Mic 2 has a more modern close sound, which we did with dynamic mics and modern overheads. It's muted by default, but it's here if you'd like to use it for modern sounding productions or just to add more detail. Mic 3 is a vintage room position that we recorded with a blend of an AEA ribbon and Neumann U47 in mono at slightly different distances away from the percussion. And it's really key to the vintage studio sound, in my opinion. So here are the bongos with mic 1 only. And here's mic 2. And here's mic 3. So you can hear the difference there. You can adjust the level or mute each of the mic positions, and it will affect all the instruments in the ensemble. So if you want more control, load up the singles, and then you can dial it in just the way you want for each instrument. Okay, now I'm just going to pull up a single patch of the tempo synced loops. If you hover your mouse over each key, you can see what the original tempo of the sample was. For the maracas, we have 3 options at each tempo. There's steady 8th notes, steady 16th notes, and a busier ad-lib pattern. The tambourine loops are similar, but they just don't have the ad-lib option. Space Age Rhythm comes with 2 drum instruments. One has samples played with sticks, and another combines samples played with brushes and mallets in a single instrument. These drums were recorded at Acoustic Recording in Brooklyn using our authentic Soundware approach of a minimalist microphone setup, including a mono U47 overhead, RCA 77 room mic, and this time a 1960s AKG D12 on the kick. The controls are the same for both instruments, and they're relatively straightforward. There's just a simple mixer which gives you volume and pan control for each element in the kit. The key mapping is similar to the general MIDI protocol for the core elements like the kick, the snare, the hats, the crash, the ride, but we did our own thing for the rest. So if you're feeling a bit stuck, you can just hover your mouse over a key on the keyboard and the help text will identify what sound is mapped to that key. I'm just quickly going to play through most of the available sounds on the kit, but please check out the other demos to hear the kit in action as a whole. So here's the set played with sticks. And here's the set played with mallets and brushes. Okay, that wraps up the drums. The bass on this library was played by one of the busiest, most working jazz bass players in New York City, and we recorded him at Acoustic Recording in Brooklyn with 2 mic positions. The mic is selected using these radio buttons in the lower left-hand corner, and they were only intended to be used one at a time. The first mic is their Mint Telefunken U47 in a standard position, and the second is an RCA 44 that we place slightly further away and has a more vintage sounding perspective and tone. There are 2 simple tone controls to adjust the amount of treble and bass. In a contemporary context, I personally opt for the 47 with the tone just flat. In a vintage context, I prefer the 44 with some of the top rolled off and a slight bass boost. So let's hear the difference. Here's the 47. And here's the 44. There are 2 articulations available, sustain and staccato, which can be selected using the standard key switch keys on C0 and C#0, or by just clicking on the articulation's name in the UI. One of the standout instruments in this library is our vintage 1960s Hohner tube organ. It's a really unique sounding instrument that can at times kind of sound like a very early synthesizer. We've sampled a variety of registrations from the tone groupings on the instrument, which you can select here via key switch. You can also add some extra interest to the tone by using these vibrato controls. The first switch turns the vibrato effect on or off. The next one toggles the vibrato speed, and the last one toggles the vibrato depth. On the right-hand side, you'll see this swell slider, which is a typical organ volume control. It's mapped to the mod wheel by default, but if you happen to have a MIDI expression pedal, you could assign it to this control for a really true organ experience. The amp/tone controls give you some more tonal options. Like the guitar and the lap steel, you could leave this set to DI and either just use it as is or with your own amp modeler, or you can select from 3 cabinet options. Brit is the NI Vox modeler, Leslie is a Leslie cabinet with the rotator turned off, and Rotate is a Leslie style effect with the rotator on. One of the nice things about the NI rotator effect is that you can change the speed of the rotator while you're playing, which can add a cool like swirling effect when it transitions from one speed to another. And we've added a few ways to control the rotate speed toggle switch. One is simply to just click on the button. The other is to tap the sustain pedal. This can be fun, especially in a live context. It simply toggles to the opposite of the current state, whatever it is. Then we've also added 2 key switches in yellow down here that are linked to a particular setting. So C1 will always sets it to slow, and C#1 sets it to fast. This is the most consistent way to record and play back the changes on a track in your DAW. You could also just assign a slider or knob on your MIDI controller to this control and handle it that way. I'll just quickly play a few chords with each of the registrations for you to hear, and I'll switch between them using the key switch keys starting on C0. Okay, I'm going to go back to the full registration and let you hear the effect of the vibrato controls now. And now I'll just play a few options with the amp and tone control, so I'll just mess around a bit. This instrument is really fun to play and just adds that nostalgic swingin' 60s thing to a track. I think the most unique instrument in this library is this Bossa Guitar, which is inspired by the classic Brazilian sound of the 1960s. It's great as a supporting harmonic foundation for a track, but there's something about it that really gives that authentic feel. You may notice I'm not calling it a nylon string guitar, even though it is, and that's because it's really not intended as a universal nylon string guitar. Instead, we specifically sampled it doing the bossa nova style of playing, which is basically broken down in 2 parts. In the lower portion of the instrument, you can play basic sustained bass notes. And the upper portion of the instrument, you play sampled performances of quintessential bossa nova chord voicings for 11 different chord qualities. Each chord type was sampled in all 12 keys with 3 different note lengths, short, medium, and long, and multiple round robins for each. For maximum authenticity, the chord voicings in the short and medium lengths don't contain the root note, which is customary in this genre because the root is usually played by the bass player or the bass notes of the guitar. And I also want to make it clear that the script is not the type where it's like identifying the notes you play and then quote strums a chord made up of single note samples to play the chord for you. Like other than those bass notes, there are no single note samples. The samples are recordings of full chords. In this style of music, the guitar doesn't generally play melodic roles, so we just focused on capturing its accompaniment role in the most authentic way we could think of. Okay, moving on. Let me take you through the UI for a moment, because this is probably the most complicated instrument in the library. At the very top are our standard controls, And then below that is our chord pattern assistant. I'm going to return to that a bit later because it's totally optional whether you use it or not. On the far right, you'll see two volume knobs that allow you to adjust the balance of the volume between the bass notes and the chords. And in the center, you'll see this box, which shows you the currently selected chord. Now, this box is important because it's connected to three very important keys on the keyboard. The three red keys on the keyboard, A2 through B2, are our so-called strum keys. When you play A2, it will play the short length sample of the currently selected chord. B flat 2 will play the medium length. And B2 will play the longs. So this way you can easily strum a bossa style rhythm of that chord. And when you add in the bass notes, you get a full bossa guitar part. So to set the current chord type, meaning major, minor, what have you, you use the key switches starting on C0. And the chords available are major 6, major 7, minor triad, minor 6, minor 7, minor with a major 7th, minor 7 flat 5, diminished 7th, dominant 7 add 9, dominant 7th flat 9, and dominant 7th sharp 5. Just a quick aside, for the long chords, there's actually only one dominant chord type, which is a plain dominant 7 chord. So that sets the chord type, but you also need to set the root of the chord, i.e. is it a C chord, an E flat chord, an F sharp chord? So there are two ways to do that. You can either use an extra set of key switches that we have at the top of the keyboard, starting on C6, or you can play any of the keys between C and C6, which will simultaneously set the root to that note and play a chord of the corresponding chord length, like this. So, for example, say you wanted to strum some F major 7 chords. You would set the chord type to the major 7 chord type using the lower key switch key, and then you could either set the root to F using the upper key switches and strum your chord using the strum keys. So watch the middle of the keyboard as I use the red keys here. Or instead of using the strum keys, I could play the chord lengths I want using these mid-range keys, and the root of the chord will change with whatever key I'm playing here. Watch the yellow and pink keys just above middle C. So I hope that makes sense. Now, that's a bit complicated, but there's yet another way to do things, which is with the chord pattern assistant I mentioned earlier. This is something I developed that's not really a sequencer, it's simply a helper tool that you can use to set the current chord without having to play two key switches at once or remember where a given chord type is found on the keyboard. Then you can just use the strum keys and focus on playing your groove and pattern the way you like. So here's how it works. There are two rows. The top row has slots for the chord root of that position in the pattern, and the bottom row is the chord type that will go with the root note above it. So you would create a pattern of chord root notes and chord types. Say I did a 1-6-2-5 in the key of C. Okay. Now, if you look at the keyboard, you'll see there are two orange keys on C1 and C sharp 1. The C sharp is your pattern restart button. It sets the pattern back to the beginning. So when you use this pattern in your DAW, you would normally record this note right at the top of your song or at any additional point after that where you want the pattern to start over. Then the C1 key will advance the pattern to whatever the next step is. I'm playing the C1 key like this, and it cycles through. I hope this is making sense. So let's record a little example here in Pro Tools. I have my pattern set up, I've got a click track, and I'm going to record in a reset note just a split second before the downbeat of the first bar. and I'm going to record an advance note a split second before the downbeat of each subsequent bar, just the way you would with an articulation key switch. So here goes. Okay, now that that's in, I'm going to record a second pass where I'll use my right hand to play the strum keys, and I'll play the bass notes with my left hand. And this may not sound amazing, I'm not Herbie Hancock by any means, but here we go. Alright, so I hope you get the idea from that. If there was a bass player, typically the guitar wouldn't play those bass notes, but in this case I just added it to make the harmony clearer for you. Now keep in mind that just because the pattern is active, doesn't mean you can't still do all the other things simultaneously. So say in that fourth bar with the G7 add 9, I wanted it to change to a G7 flat 9 halfway through the bar. Well, I can just add an additional chord type key switch note on beat 3, but keep the pattern going the way it is. So I'll just overdub that one note now. It's an A0. I could also have changed a root key switch. In fact, let's do that. I'll delete the last thing I did, and I'm going to change this bass note from a G to a D flat. And I'll play a D flat root note key switch, which is D flat 6 up here, to add a tritone substitution to a D flat 7 in that spot. Okay. Okay, now imagine you've got that up and running, and you kind of like what you've done, but you want to maybe put it aside and try something else. You can click this bypass button, and those pattern reset and pattern advance keys won't do anything. They won't cause the currently selected chord in this box to change. So you could experiment with something else without erasing your pattern. Another thing you can do is transpose your whole pattern up or down with these buttons here. But bear in mind that it's only changing how the currently selected chord will be set. So it won't change any notes you've recorded in your sequencer, and the strum keys won't be affected, but neither will the bass notes or any one-off chord root key switches. Now say you find you don't like your pattern anymore and you know you want to start over, you can just hit this init button here and it will empty out all the slots. I found that the best workflow for me is to use the pattern assistant to sketch the beginnings of a song, mainly just to get the strumming pattern established and recorded in my DAW using the strum keys, and then I'll either bypass or delete the pattern assistant notes and replace them with standard key switches and take it from there. Next, I'll usually just freeze or commit the whole track as audio so that I can move around freely in my session without worrying about chasing all those key switches. So that's the Bossa Guitar. That was a lot. I think once you experiment around with it, you'll get the hang of things. But if you're confused about anything, please leave a comment below or send an email through the website and I'll do my best to explain. When we were recording Space Age Pop, we ended up having a little bit of extra time at the end of the session. So I had the orchestra dash off this fun little bonus patch of orchestrated staccatos. It's our Space Age Pop strings and winds, and it's just a couple round robins with a cool vintage mix that has a lot of personality and charm. I've been using it myself for my composing projects, and I've really been able to get a lot of mileage out of it already. Here's how it sounds. So that's it for this in-depth walkthrough. I hope it answered all or at least most of your questions. If you need any help, just leave us a comment below or contact us through the website. Okay, thanks for watching.